Hey, Zach here. As you can see, today I'm sticking pretty close to home. Now, if you've seen my previous videos, you know that railroad and canal history is a passion of mine. But what you probably don't know is that I'm a huge board game fan too. You can see from the shelves behind me that a whole corner of my house is devoted to the hobby. And there are definitely a couple of railroad-themed games in the mix too. Now, this love of board games has been a part of my life since I was a little kid, and it all started with this old game right here, Monopoly. We all know this game, most of us have played it, a select few of us might have actually finished a game of Monopoly. But tucked away on this board are 4 reminders of our industrial heritage, representing the corporate giants that helped shape America's history. For many players, they're little more than spots to land on, rents to pay, or sets to complete. But behind each name is a story of ambition, innovation, triumph, and decline. Today, we'll be looking at the history of the railroads of Monopoly. Although before we get to the railroads, I would be remiss if I didn't at least touch on the sordid history of Monopoly itself. The game's been around for over 100 years in one form or another, starting as the landlord's game, designed by Lizzie Magie in 1903 as a means of teaching the dangers of monopolies. Indeed, there were even 2 different rule sets. One was called Prosperity, in which all players were rewarded for any wealth created, and the other was called Monopoly, where the aim was to crush your opponents by creating monopolies. A lot of the familiar Monopoly mechanics were present in the landlord's game, including the presence of the railroad spaces on the board, but the properties all had more generic, sometimes cynical names, like Lonely Lane, Easy Street, and Gee Whiz Railroad. Over the next 30 years, many different knockoff versions of the game were published, circumventing Magie's original patent. These would often feature different property names to cater to the local population. This should sound fairly familiar considering how many different versions of Monopoly exist today. There seems to be a different version for every city, state, and even fictional franchise. In 1934, a man named Charles Darrow happened on one of these variants and decided to begin publishing it himself. With very minor graphical changes, he rebranded the game under the title Monopoly. Darrow eventually sold his version to board game giant Parker Brothers. When the company learned of Magie's original patent, Parker Brothers bought the rights for a meager $500, with no option for residual earnings. For years, Charles Darrow was touted as the sole inventor of the game. Maggie's role was not recognized until decades later. When Parker Brothers began marketing the game in 1935, the properties were all derived from streets in Atlantic City, New Jersey, at the time nicknamed America's Playground. The railroads on the board no longer had made-up, tongue-in-cheek names. Now they were named after real-life railroads that either serviced Atlantic City directly or had some control over ones that did. So let's take a look at each railroad in turn, starting with the oldest, the B&O. Aside from being the oldest on the Monopoly board, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was actually the first railroad in America. Chartered in Maryland in 1827, with the United States having only recently celebrated its 50th birthday, the B&O was envisioned to connect the fast-growing port city of Baltimore with the Ohio River, giving access to the expanding markets in the western frontier states. Construction began in 1828, and by 1830 the first 13 miles were completed, between Baltimore and Ellicott's Mills, the present-day Ellicott City. As it charted new territory in the transportation field, the B&O's early years were highly experimental in terms of track design and train power. For the tracks, the company engineers outlined a number of options, eventually settling on one involving strap iron rails fastened to underlying granite slabs called stringers. These proved impractical because the granite was expensive, difficult and time-consuming to work with, and proved to be too unforgiving for the tracks. Eventually, the railroad moved on to the cheaper, more forgiving wooden ties and the heavier, more reliable T-rails that we see on modern railroads. However, remnants of those original granite stringers can still be found along the B&O's old main line today. For its first year of operation, B&O rail cars were pulled by horses. But during that year, the company tested a new steam-powered locomotive called the Tom Thumb on their newly completed section of track. Historical accounts say this testing included a race between the Tom Thumb locomotive and a horse-drawn carriage. While the locomotive ultimately lost this challenge, mainly due to mechanical problems, its potential superior performance could not be ignored, and by late 1831, the B&O had discontinued horsepower altogether in favor of steam-powered locomotives. From its humble beginnings, the railroad expanded, connecting Baltimore with the nation's capital in 1835. By 1852, the B&O had pushed west to Wheeling, then part of Virginia, making it the first railroad to connect the Ohio River with the Atlantic seaboard and satisfying its chartered goal. The B&O was a vital supply line for the Union during the American Civil War, making it a target for numerous raids by Confederate forces. Despite significant damage from these attacks, the railroad proved resilient, often repairing and reopening sections of track at its own expense. In the latter half of the 19th century, the B&O continued to expand, and by its peak in the 1920s, it offered rail service from St. Louis, Missouri in the west to the New York City metropolitan area in the east. It didn't actually have trackage rights into Manhattan, but its controlling interest in other railroads got passengers as far as Jersey City. From there, they were bused or ferried into the city. By the 1950s, the B&O's passenger rail traffic was on the decline, due to competition with the automobile, commercial airlines, and even rivals like the Pennsylvania Railroad, which had better access to key commercial centers. In 1958, the B&O discontinued all rail service north of Baltimore, and it ceded all remaining passenger service to Amtrak upon its creation in 1971. Despite some mergers and acquisitions, the B&O existed as a corporate entity until it was merged into CSX Transportation in 1987. Today, modern trains still use the vast rail network and infrastructure built by the B&O, rumbling past surviving remnants of this historic railroad. Now you may wonder why the B&O is even on the Monopoly board, since we can see on this map that it didn't have tracks into Atlantic City, New Jersey. Well, aside from just being a hugely recognizable railroad at the time Monopoly was developed, it did actually have a connection to Atlantic City through one of the railroads it had controlling interest in. And as it happens, that is the railroad we'll talk about next, the Reading Railroad. And before we get too far into it, yes, it is pronounced Reading, even though it is spelled Reading. That's because it is named after the city of Reading, Pennsylvania. Now, while it is called the Reading Railroad on the game board, that was never one of its official names. The railroad was chartered in 1833 as the Philadelphia and Reading Railway, with a straightforward but ambitious goal to move anthracite coal from the mines of northeastern Pennsylvania to the ports, industries, and homes of Philadelphia. The railroad's founders saw an opportunity to create a more efficient, year-round transport system that could outcompete the state-owned Schuylkill Canal. Construction began in 1836, and by 1842, the initial 88-mile main line was complete from Philadelphia to Pottsville in the heart of the coal regions. The railroad quickly proved its worth as anthracite, dense, clean-burning hard coal, was in rising demand for home heating, iron making, and steam power. The Reading became the crucial artery linking the coal fields to the eastern markets, powering the region's industrialization. Over the next few decades, the railroad would expand further northwestward into the coal-rich regions of the state, while at the same time buying up many of the mines and feeder railroads in the area. In Philadelphia, it constructed Port Richmond, which the company proclaimed to be the largest privately owned railroad tidewater terminal in the world. By the 1870s, the P&R Railroad was the largest company in the world, controlling much of the region's anthracite coal market, from mining to transport and on to shipping. The railroad expanded eastward, pushing into New Jersey and allowing for coal delivery to ports and markets in the New York City metropolitan area. The P&R weathered economic depressions and bankruptcies in the late 1800s and was forced to reorganize under suspicions of monopoly. This led to the creation of the Reading Company in 1896, created to serve as a holding company for the rail and coal subsidiaries. The passage of the Hepburn Act in 1906 required the company to disinvest themselves of all mining properties and operations. Thereafter, the Reading Company became synonymous with the railroad itself. Despite these setbacks, the railroad continued to be profitable, and the Reading invested in many improvement projects around the turn of the 20th century. Among these was the construction of the famous Reading Terminal in Philadelphia, which served as both a passenger station and the company's headquarters. They also greatly expanded their maintenance and fabrication shops in Reading, Pennsylvania. Despite its many successes, the Reading was destined to remain a regional railroad, although it had long aspired to be a long-distance trunk line. Throughout the mid-20th century, it struggled to remain relevant in the face of shrinking demand for anthracite coal, the general decline in northeastern manufacturing, and increased competition from trucks and automobiles. In the early 1970s, the Reading filed for bankruptcy, becoming one of several northeastern railroads to fail during the decade. In 1976, the federal government created the Consolidated Rail Corporation to reorganize the assets of 7 failing private railroad companies, including those of the Reading. Conrail did continue to operate a limited amount of passenger service on ex-Reading lines until the early 1980s, when the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority, or SEPTA, was created to handle commuter rail services. Conrail itself was bought out by both CSX and Norfolk Southern in 1999, with the companies evenly dividing up the rail assets. These days, much of the old Reading Railroad territory is serviced by Norfolk Southern. Although a good portion of the Reading's former coal region trackage was purchased by the regional Reading and Northern Railroad, which continues the tradition of hauling anthracite coal, as well as providing numerous excursion trains in northeastern Pennsylvania. While the Reading Railroad has been gone for nearly 50 years, much of its infrastructure lives on, including the old Reading shops and the Reading Terminal, which have both been repurposed to meet our modern shopping and industrial needs. Well, that's 2 of the monopoly railroads whose real-life counterparts have been lost to history. Let's see if the Pennsylvania Railroad fared any better. The Pennsylvania Railroad, often shortened to Pennsy or the PRR, was chartered in 1846 to connect the state capital of Harrisburg with the growing city of Pittsburgh in the west. Before then, travel between the 2 cities relied on the main line of public works, a state-run combination of canals, portage railways, and river travel which was slow and susceptible to seasonal weather. Completed in 1854, this initial line had to cross the Allegheny Mountains using such engineering milestones as the Gallitzin tunnels and the famous Horseshoe Curve, which allowed trains to navigate the steep terrain without excessive grades. In 1857, the Pennsy purchased the main line of public works and incorporated it into its growing transportation network. By the early 1860s, it had an all-rail network connecting Philadelphia with Pittsburgh. During the American Civil War, the Pennsylvania Railroad became a logistical lifeline for the Union. It transported troops, ammunition, supplies, and even political leaders. Its reliable service helped reinforce its national importance and made it a strategic asset that was, at times, the target of Confederate attacks. After the war, the railroad expanded in all directions. It built lines into New York State, New Jersey, Maryland, and even Illinois. By the 1870s, it operated a vast trunk line system linking the Atlantic seaboard to the Midwest and fueling the nation's industrial boom. By 1882, the Pennsy was the most powerful railroad in the United States and the largest corporation in the world. The company invested heavily in its infrastructure, expanding terminals and yards, and building massive shop complexes like the Altoona Works, which became one of the world's largest repair and construction facilities for locomotives and railcars. Perhaps chief among its accomplishments during this time were the tunnels it built to allow direct rail service into Manhattan, as well as the architectural marvel that was Penn Station. The station and connecting tunnels were opened in 1910 and allowed access to Manhattan from New Jersey without having to use a ferry, making the Pennsy the only railroad to enter New York City from the south. By World War I, the Pennsylvania Railroad operated over 10,000 miles of track and controlled vast real estate, coal mines, dock operations, and telegraph networks. It carried more freight and passengers than any railroad in the world. Despite its dominant position, the Pennsy suffered the same hardships as the other railroads during the mid-20th century. These included increased federal regulation, as well as competition with automobiles and commercial airlines, leading to reductions in passenger and freight revenues. By the 1960s, aging infrastructure, deferred maintenance, and high labor costs strained the company. To survive, the Pennsylvania Railroad sought a merger with its longtime rival, the New York Central Railroad. This merger was completed in 1968, creating the Penn Central Transportation Company. It became one of the most disastrous mergers in U.S. corporate history. The new company faced incompatible systems, internal corporate warfare, and even abnormally harsh weather, on top of continued passenger decline. Just 2 years later, in 1970, the Penn Central filed for bankruptcy, which was at the time the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history, which sent a ripple effect through the other Northeast railroads, who depended on Penn Central to keep their own freight moving. Passenger services were transferred to the newly created Amtrak in 1971, and all Penn Central lines were transferred to Conrail in 1976. Most ex-Pennsy lines went to Norfolk Southern when Conrail was divided in 1999. While the once powerful Pennsylvania Railroad is lost to history, some of its biggest engineering milestones live on today, while others are but a mere shadow of their former selves. In the early 20th century, both the Reading and the Pennsylvania Railroad served the South Jersey Seashore, including Atlantic City. Their competition was so intense that the lines sometimes ran parallel to each other for miles, with trains racing to be the first to arrive at destinations along the Jersey Shore. In the early 1930s, both railroads faced declining profits due to the Great Depression and the growing popularity of the automobile. In 1933, the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities ordered the merger of the two companies' Seashore-based lines as a means of increasing efficiency, reducing redundancy, and cutting costs. From this merger, the Pennsylvania Reading Seashore lines were created, with the Pennsy having 2/3 ownership and the Reading taking the other third. This merger did little to improve profits, and as both parent railroads entered bankruptcy in the 1970s, the Seashore lines was taken over by Conrail, who continued to run limited passenger service until 1982. And that covers the three big railroads from the Monopoly Board, as well as their ties to Atlantic City. But we're still left with one to go, and this one is potentially the most nebulous in terms of its origins. Unlike the other three, which were obviously real and historically significant railroads, Short Line is the outlier, considering that a railroad by that name never actually existed. Its origins on the Monopoly Board are tangled in a mix of terminology, geography, and game development quirks, which makes it strangely mysterious and surprisingly interesting. In railroad terminology, a short line is a real concept. It refers to a small, local, usually privately owned railroad that often connects rural industries like mines or farms to the larger Class I railroads like CSX or Norfolk Southern. Short lines have existed for as long as there have been railroads, and right now there are over 600 short lines operating in the US alone, representing about 30% of the nation's freight rail system. So even if Monopoly's short line doesn't point to a single historical entity, it does connect to genuine railroad culture. For the longest time, I believed that the short line space on the Monopoly Board referred to the presence of these general short lines in the railroad food chain. A railroad placeholder, if you will, that sounded generic and complemented the board's symmetry rather than being a representation of any particular transportation company. But that might not actually be accurate. There is a widely accepted explanation that the game's short line is an abbreviation of the Shore Fast Line, which was an actual railroad with ties to Atlantic City. The Shore Fast Line was an electric streetcar line operated by the Atlantic City and Shore Railroad, and consisting of an 11-mile route connecting Atlantic City to Ocean City, New Jersey, which included a 2-mile-long trestle across the Great Egg Harbor Bay. The line was active from 1907 until the trestle was damaged by a hurricane in 1948. The cost to repair this damage proved too high, considering the general decline in trolley ridership at the time, and the line was forever abandoned. Portions of the old right-of-way have been repurposed as the Summers Point bike path between Pleasantville and Summers Point, New Jersey. So in the end, the Monopoly Short Line sits at a crossroads between fact, fiction, and design convenience. It's a name that feels authentic, has a potential but unconfirmed historical reference, and fits naturally into the board's lineup. And even though it never had the industrial might of the Reading, the prestige of the Pennsylvania, or the national footprint of the B&O, it holds a special place as the quirky, ambiguous fourth railroad, the one whose mystery is a part of its charm. And that completes our look at the railroads of the Monopoly board. What strikes me most is how these once powerful companies, names that shaped industries, cities, and entire regions, now survive mainly as squares on a game board. They may not command the power that they once did, but on that iconic board, they're immortalized. Tiny reminders of an era when rail was king, and those names were anything but small. So the next time you play Monopoly, keep in mind the storied history of those 4 railroads that live on not just on the game board, but in the legacy they left behind. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and consider subscribing so that you don't miss any future content. I have many more videos in the works where I'll explore different facets of history a piece at a time, often involving the railroads that I talked about today. Until next time, see you later.